There's a strange paradox at the heart of modern life. People are busier than ever, yet they finish almost nothing. We rush from project to project with the enthusiasm of someone who believes that starting is already a form of progress. But the truth is harsher. Most beginnings evaporate, most intentions dissolve, and most plans barely survive their first week. It's not because people are weak, lazy, or incapable. It's because the world pulls them apart before they have the time to gather themselves. We live in an age designed to scatter the mind. Notifications tug at us every minute. Expectations from others arrive disguised as emergencies. And the smallest hint of boredom pushes us to open a new tab, a new app, a new distraction. We don't abandon our goals. Our goals are simply drowned by the noise. And when the noise wins long enough, something inside us quietly collapses. We stop believing our own promises. We become suspicious of our future selves. We know we'll start, but we no longer trust that we'll finish. What's tragic is that most people never identify the actual source of this frustration. They think the problem is motivation or discipline or time management. They blame their mood, their job, their environment. But beneath all these layers, there's a far deeper issue, an absence of center. Not the metaphoric center of someone who meditates or journals, but a literal inner axis around which life can stabilize. Imagine a spinning top. As long as it turns around its center, it stands. The moment the axis weakens, it wobbles, slips, and finally collapses. Human beings are not very different. Without a defined center, a fixed point of identity, commitment, or direction, our days wobble. We become reactive instead of intentional, drifting instead of moving. We answer every request, hesitate at every choice, and feel pulled in directions we never consciously selected. And what's worse, this lack of center produces a particular kind of fatigue. Not the fatigue of effort, but the fatigue of dispersion. It is possible to be exhausted without having done anything meaningful. It is possible to feel overwhelmed while achieving almost nothing. That is the exhaustion of someone who spends their energy without aim, who pours themselves into 1,000 cracks instead of a single vessel. Most people don't realize how much this absence of a fixed point eats away at their confidence. When you start but don't finish, you don't merely lose time. You erode the trust you have in yourself. You become a spectator of your own inconsistency. And slowly, quietly, you stop expecting anything solid from your own hands. This section of your life, the place where projects die before they grow roots, has nothing to do with intelligence or ambition. It has everything to do with the missing center, a place you stand on no matter what the world demands, a position that doesn't shift with the weather of your emotions. Without that, you're like a compass needle spinning, without north. You move, yes. You try, yes, but you never land. The true problem is not the number of projects abandoned. The true problem is the absence of something stable enough inside you to hold against the tide. And until that center is found, every project will feel heavier than it should, every distraction more powerful than it ought to be, every beginning more fragile than you want to admit. The Stoics believe that a human being cannot live well without a place to stand inside themselves. Not a physical location, not a title or a role given by society, but a silent point of duty that one chooses deliberately. They called it a post, like the position a soldier occupies on a wall. It doesn't look grand. It's not something you flaunt. But it is the anchor that prevents you from being swept away by the shifting winds of circumstance. Most people think of discipline as forcing themselves to do difficult things. The Stoics saw it differently. For them, discipline was not about strength but about position. You don't resist the world by clenching your jaw. You resist it by knowing where you stand. A soldier who knows his post doesn't need to ask himself every minute whether he should stay. The question is settled. His energy is free for action, not for negotiation. This idea may seem austere, but there is a deep gentleness in it. The inner post is not a cage. It is a home. It's the place where your actions stop being random and become coherent. It's what gives shape to your days and direction to your efforts. Without it, you live in reaction. With it, you live with intention. The modern world teaches us the opposite. It trains us to keep our options open, to stay flexible, to avoid anything that binds us. But this endless flexibility is precisely what makes people weak. A life filled with infinite options, but no commitments, is like a tree with wide branches and shallow roots. It looks free, but the first storm will tear it out of the ground. The stoic post is the root. Not glamorous, not visible, but indispensable. It is the part of you that remains when everything else changes. When the external world becomes chaotic, when your emotions fluctuate, when distractions pull at your attention, the post stays still. And because it stays, you stay. Think of it this way. Every day, you wake up in a world that is larger than you, louder than you, and full of forces that don't care about your plans. If you don't choose where to stand, the world chooses for you. It assigns you a position based on its urgencies and its noise. Before noon, your day no longer belongs to you. You're already serving someone else's priorities. The Stoic refuses this passive drift. By choosing a post, writing, studying, exercising, meditating, working on a craft, anything that strengthens the soul, they reclaim a piece of ground. They declare, this is where I stand. This is where I return. This is the point from which I act. And something remarkable happens when you do that. The chaos outside becomes less frightening, not because it disappears, but because it no longer determines your movement. You are not tossed around by impulse. You are not seduced by every possibility. You have a center, a fixed line that doesn't move even when you do. The inner post becomes a quiet form of freedom. It doesn't shout. It doesn't shine. It simply holds. And in holding, it turns your life from a series of scattered attempts into a path that leads somewhere. This is what the Stoics understood. Strength is not the absence of weakness. It is the presence of a place within yourself that does not retreat. They say wisdom often begins in a room much smaller than the life it will eventually transform. And in this story, the room was nothing more than a simple chamber, bare walls, a wooden bench, and an old philosopher whose presence seemed to quiet the air itself. People came to him not for comfort, but for clarity. And clarity, as he loved to remind them, rarely arrives without discomfort. One day, a young man entered, bright-eyed, restless, full of ambition that seemed to burn faster than he could fuel it. He sat down in front of the teacher with a posture halfway between determination and exhaustion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had failed himself too many times. "Master," he said, "I want to live with strength. I want to be disciplined, consistent, reliable. But every time I make a promise to myself, I abandon it. I begin with fire and end with ashes. My projects collapse before they grow. My resolutions break before they have a chance to stand. I feel like a ship that slips its own anchor the moment the wind rises." The old philosopher didn't answer immediately. He watched the young man with a sort of patient compassion, as if he had heard the confession 100 times before and yet still understood its pain each time anew. After a long silence, he finally asked, "If you were a soldier and you were assigned a post of guard, what would you do?" The young man blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the question. "I would stay," he replied. "I would remain at my position until my duty was done. And if someone offered you money to leave your post, I would refuse. And if they mocked you, threatened you, promised you a life of ease elsewhere." The young man straightened his back. "I would stay, master. A post given must be a post held." The philosopher leaned forward. "Then tell me, why do you abandon the post you assigned to yourself?" The question struck harder than any lecture could have. The young man looked down, almost ashamed. He had never realized the contradiction. He would honor the orders of any commander, but not the orders of his own soul. He defended the commitments imposed by others, yet treated his personal commitments as casual suggestions. Quietly, he said, "Because I do not see my own commitments as real. I treat them as optional." The old man smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. "And that," he said, "is the root of your suffering. You consider the promises you make to yourself as if they were written on sand. You demand more loyalty from yourself toward strangers than toward your own values. Choose one post, just one, and guard it as if your entire life depended on it, because in many ways it does." The young man left that day with only a single task: choose a post and refuse to abandon it. Not a grand mission, not a dramatic vow, just a position he would not betray. And something remarkable began to shift inside him. Not overnight. No real transformation is instant, but gradually, as one keeps returning to a place long enough for it to shape them. His days acquired a rhythm. His mind gained a structure. He was no longer the ship pulling up its own anchor. He became the kind of person who stays. The story isn't famous, because most life-changing truths never make their way into books. But it survives because it asks a question that pierces anyone who has ever betrayed their own resolutions. Why you hold the commitments given by others sacred, yet treat your own as disposable? For the Stoics, this was not a rhetorical question. It was a beginning of responsibility. The young man's strength did not come from his willpower. It came from the moment he began treating his inner word as something that deserved obedience, not from fear, but from respect. The teacher had not given him a technique. He had given him a shift of identity. There's a particular kind of damage that doesn't leave visible wounds. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't bruise, it doesn't draw anyone's attention. Yet it is one of the most corrosive forces in human life. The repeated betrayal of your own commitments. People imagine that failing a resolution is a small thing, a minor inconvenience, a moment of weakness they can shrug off. But every time you promise yourself something and fail to follow through, you are carving a crack inside the structure of who you are. The first time you abandon a project, you feel guilty. The second time, you feel disappointed. But the 10th time, the 20th, your mind stops reacting. The betrayal becomes normal. And in that normalization lies the real tragedy, the quiet erosion of self-trust. You begin to speak to yourself like someone who cannot be relied upon. You hear your own promises, and you no longer believe them. They become background noise, a kind of private fiction you tell yourself to feel momentarily inspired. And once you stop believing your own word, your identity fractures. You may still appear functional, even successful from the outside. You may work hard, speak confidently, maintain an image of competence. But internally, there's a split. One part of you continues to desire growth, while another part whispers, you won't follow through anyway. This internal contradiction drains more energy than any external difficulty ever could. The most dangerous part is that self-betrayal becomes easier with repetition. The mind is a master of adaptation. What you do once is an act. What you do repeatedly becomes a pattern. What you do without resistance becomes a trait. You train yourself unconsciously to respond to difficulty by stepping back. You develop a reflex of escape. And once this reflex is established, it infiltrates every corner of your life. A difficult conversation? Avoid it. A challenging project? Delay it. A meaningful habit? Drop it. The pattern repeats itself until the exceptions are rarer than the rule. People often think procrastination is a problem, but procrastination is only the surface. Underneath lies something more severe, a reputation you built with yourself. Every choice adds or subtracts from it. When you keep your word, even in small things, you reinforce a sense that you are someone capable of carrying weight. When you break it, you reinforce a belief that you cannot. This is why Stoic thinkers insisted that inner discipline is not about productivity, but about integrity. The danger is not merely that you fail to finish a project. The danger is that you reshape your character into someone who expects failure from themselves. The world outside can doubt you, and you will survive. But the moment you begin to doubt yourself, you lose the foundation necessary to pursue anything with conviction. Imagine trying to build a house on soil that shifts each time you step on it. No structure survives. That is what a fragmented inner life feels like. No matter how many plans you make, how many ideas you generate, how many new beginnings you chase, everything rests on unstable ground. The collapse is not dramatic. It's subtle, cumulative, almost invisible. And because it is invisible, most people never realize why their lives feel heavy, chaotic, or directionless. The irony is that this damage isn't created by external forces. It is created by small, repeated moments where you abandon yourself. The broken promise you think no one saw, the skipped commitment you think doesn't matter, they all matter because you saw them. Your mind keeps a record. Your character forms around that record. Your confidence grows or dies according to that record. This is why the Stoic idea of holding your post is so powerful. It is not a metaphor for stubbornness. It is a defense against inner collapse. A single commitment held consistently can reverse years of self-doubt. It proves to you, in action rather than intention, that you are capable of loyalty, not to others, but to yourself. You cannot hide from the consequences of self-betrayal, because the person you betray is the same one you must live with every day. And until you understand this, discipline will always feel like a burden instead of a form of liberation. There is a myth that has crippled more lives than failure ever could: the belief that progress depends on feeling inspired. People wait for motivation as if it were some divine wind that will finally push them forward. They sit still, hoping for a surge of energy, a spark of passion, a perfect moment. And when that moment doesn't come, or worse, when it comes and fades quickly, they think something is wrong with them. Something is wrong with the story they were told. Motivation is not a foundation. It is weather. It changes without warning, arrives unpredictably, and disappears the second conditions shift. It is wonderful when it's there, but it was never meant to hold the weight of an entire life. Yet we keep treating it as our engine, our guide, our fuel. No wonder so many people feel inconsistent. They are trying to build stability on something that is, by nature, unstable. Discipline, in contrast, is not emotional. It does not depend on mood or excitement. Discipline comes from identity, from the deep, internal decision that I am the kind of person who does this. It is a choice repeated until it becomes a definition. When discipline is rooted in identity, action becomes inevitable. Not easy, not pleasant, but inevitable in the same way breathing is inevitable. You do not negotiate with yourself about whether you feel like it. You do it because it is who you are. Motivation is a spark. Discipline is a direction. And this is where most people misunderstand themselves. They think they lack motivation, but what they truly lack is a stable identity around their commitments. They haven't decided who they are in relation to their goals. They are trying to act with the strength of someone they never officially chose to become. This leads to an internal tug of war. One part of you wants progress. Another part wants comfort. Motivation chooses whichever voice speaks louder in the moment. Discipline chooses the voice you declare to be yours, even when it whispers. Look closely at people who consistently achieve the things they set out to do. They are not perpetually inspired. They do not wake up every morning with fire in their chest. What they have is something quieter and infinitely more durable, an agreement with themselves that they refuse to break. They have made their post, their commitment, part of their identity. That's why the Stoics saw discipline not as punishment but as clarity. When you know your post, decisions simplify. You stop wasting energy asking, do I feel like doing this? And instead ask, is this aligned with who I am? That single shift eliminates most internal conflict. It frees you from the exhausting cycle of self-negotiation that drains more energy than the task itself. The truth is, motivation is seductive because it feels good. It makes you believe change is happening simply because you're excited about it. But excitement is not transformation. Transformation begins the moment you act without excitement. When you uphold a commitment on a day that provides you no emotional reward. That moment is the seed of character. And character is the one thing motivation can never give you. There will be days when you wake up tired, uninspired, uncertain. Days when you feel the weight of your inner doubts pressing against your chest. Days when nothing about your life or mind feels aligned with progress. These are the days motivation abandons you. But they are also the days discipline defines you. Because the test of commitment is never on the days you feel strong. The real measure is what you do when every part of you whispers, not today. If you move forward, then slowly, clumsily, imperfectly, you create a fracture in the old version of yourself. And through that fracture, a new identity forms. Discipline is not about rigidity. It's about loyalty. Loyalty to the future you want. Loyalty to the self you aspire to become. Motivation asks for excitement. Discipline asks for honesty. And honesty, though less glamorous, is far more capable of turning a life around. There comes a moment, if you persist long enough, when something subtle shifts beneath the surface of your actions. At first, discipline feels like an external structure you're forcing onto your life, a set of rules you hold with tense fingers, a rhythm you maintain with effort and vigilance. Every step requires intention. Every return to your task feels deliberate, sometimes heavy, sometimes tiring. But keep going long enough, and the strange alchemy of habit begins to work on you. What starts as something you do slowly becomes something you are. The Stoics knew this transformation well. They understood that repetition doesn't merely build skill, it sculpts identity. Even the smallest action, echoed across days, begins to gather weight. It presses into the mind, settles into bones, and eventually becomes a new way of existing in the world. What used to require discipline begins to require less thought. What once felt foreign starts to feel inevitable. This isn't about perfection. It's about familiarity. A musician practices scales until their fingers respond without conscious command. A runner ties their shoes, and their body remembers what to do before the mind even catches up. In the same way, when you hold your inner post long enough, your character starts to stand guard even when your motivation sleeps. There's a quiet magic in this shift. It doesn't announce itself with triumph or fireworks. Often, you only notice it in small moments. A morning when you rise without hesitation, an afternoon when you return to your task without inner debate. You realize you haven't argued with yourself in days. You haven't negotiated. You simply act. And in that simplicity, there's a profound sense of peace. This peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is the absence of self-conflict. The early days of commitment are full of inner friction, doubt, resistance, boredom, fear. You must push through them like someone climbing against a slope of sand, every step sliding backward a little. But eventually the ground hardens beneath your feet. Your actions gain traction. You stop fighting yourself. Your identity leans in the direction you've chosen, and the struggle transforms into momentum. This is what the Stoics called second nature. Not nature in the biological sense, but in the moral sense, the patterns of heart and mind that form the core of a person's being. Second nature is a state in which discipline stops feeling like a battle and becomes a kind of inner gravity. It pulls you toward the life you've chosen the way gravity pulls the body toward the earth. Silently, invisibly, constantly. People often misunderstand this transformation. They imagine that a disciplined person must feel strong all the time, confident all the time, determined all the time. But the truth is far simpler. The disciplined person does not feel stronger. They feel clearer. Clear about what matters. Clear about where they stand. Clear about the direction they must move, even when they move slowly. The real reward of holding your post is not the achievement that comes from it, but the identity that grows beneath it. You begin to trust yourself again. You begin to see yourself as someone capable of carrying weight without dropping it at the first sign of fatigue. You feel sturdier, more anchored, more present. And others feel it too. They may not know what changed, but they sense something in your posture, your voice, your way of moving through the world. This transformation is slow, almost invisible from day to day, but over time, it becomes unmistakable. The person who once lived in fragments begins to form into someone whole. The person who once drifted from impulse to impulse begins to walk with intention. The person who once doubted every promise they made begins to trust their own footsteps. Second nature isn't built in grand gestures. It is built in the quiet repetition of showing up on cold days, on tired days, on ordinary days. And the truth is, once the second nature takes root, it becomes very hard to lose, because what is built inside cannot be taken by circumstances outside. Your actions may begin as choices, but if you stay long enough, they become a part of your inner architecture, a structure strong enough to hold you through storms, a foundation steady enough to build a life on, a nature that doesn't waver with the weather. This is the real promise of discipline, not effort but evolution.